Okay, so 6 weeks ago, John Healey walked out of government because the Treasury wouldn't give him the money he wanted. On Monday, he was handed the keys to the Treasury. And besides a head-to-head between a bin and Nigel Farage, this may yet be one of the funniest things to happen in British politics this year. The man who quit because there wasn't enough money is now the man who has to find it. But underneath the joke, there's something that actually matters. Because getting defense spending to 3% of GDP by 2030, the thing Healey walked out over, is estimated to cost around £10 billion a year. That's about the same as putting a penny on the basic rate of income tax. So the question isn't whether taxes move under this new Chancellor, it's which ones, and which of them will affect you. Now, it's important to stress that we don't have a budget yet, so nobody knows what's going to be in it, including probably Healey himself, so this is more about probability than prophecy. But we're not guessing blind. He's got a 29-year voting record, as well as 5 years as a Treasury Minister, and he's already made his first move. So let's just look at the evidence, starting with what's already happened. From the 1st of October, VAT comes off our electricity bills. That'll cost the Exchequer around £850 million of this financial year, and the headline is that it takes £45 a year off the average bill, except it only runs 6 months, October to March. So what actually lands in your pocket is closer to £25. Whoop-de-doo. Martin Lewis has already said that people won't really feel it, and Healey himself admitted that it won't solve the cost of living. And when the Chancellor and Martin Lewis are both managing your expectations on day 2, well, that tells you something. Now, to be fair, the price cap is forecast to go up in October as well, but only by about a fiver across those 6 months. So the cut does still leave you ahead by roughly £20 over half a year. Whoop-de-doo. And here's the bit I find more interesting than the incredible savings that we can all look forward to. It's being funded by cancelling the digital ID scheme, except the IFS have pointed out the obvious problem. Digital ID itself was going to be paid for by cuts to other departments. So cancelling it doesn't release any money, it just moves the hole. The government still has to find around £850 million of cuts, and it hasn't said where from. Now, Downing Street insists it's fully funded, their argument being that departments had to find those savings anyway, so they'll just point them at this instead, which is fair enough. It also means that the savings still haven't actually been funded. And then Darren Jones, the minister who was running that scheme until Monday, came out and said that the digital ID program never had funding allocated in the first place. So we've got a tax cut funded by cancelling a program that was funded by cuts nobody's identified, which one former minister says was never funded at all. And then this morning, they did it again. £2 bus fare cap for the whole of 2027, costing over £500 million, with most of it being moved across from the energy department, including £400 million that was going to be grants for international climate projects. Healey's line was that there's no burden to the British taxpayer. 2 announcements, 2 days, both paid for by shifting money from one pocket to another. And I'm not saying that's a scandal. I'm just saying that I like to do more due diligence than this on a meal deal. But who is John Healey? Most of the coverage is treating him as a defense guy who wandered into the Treasury by accident, but that is honestly lazy and it's wrong. He was a Treasury Minister for 5 years under Blair and Brown, including the Economic Secretary, then the Financial Secretary, and the latter has primary responsibility for tax policy. Then he was a Local Government Minister, which is the Council Tax Brief, then Housing Minister, then years as Shadow Housing Secretary. We have tax, local government, and property. Hold on to that combination because it comes back later. And there's one more thing. In a BBC interview after he resigned, he had a proper go at the Treasury. He called it a paradox. Brilliant officials, but an institution whose instinct is always to say no. His specific complaint was that the Treasury treats defence spending as money going out the door instead of money coming in the form of jobs, factories and exports. And he's not wrong. And that instinct doesn't stop at defence. That's how the Treasury looks at most spending, and it needed calling out. So we now have a Chancellor that's publicly declared war on his own department before he even sat down at the desk, which is either very promising or very worrying depending on where you sit. Right, the constraint. And this is the important bit. Burnham has committed to keeping the fiscal rules, and he's also stuck with the manifesto pledge not to raise the rates of income tax, national insurance, or VAT. That is the trap that was set by Starmer and ensnared Starmer. Those 3 are roughly 2/3 of all the money the government collects, and they are bolted shut by promises. Meanwhile, the pot has shrunk. The headroom against the main fiscal rule was forecast at £23 billion back in March, while economists reckon that's now potentially potentially half. We've got rising borrowing costs, defence desperately needing money, and Burnham's promised cost of living support, council housing, and social care reform. So the promises are very big, the pot is very small, and the front door is locked, which means Healey has to use the side doors. And there are 4 of them. Side door number 1, fiscal drag. The personal allowance is frozen at £12,570 and thresholds are frozen out to 2031. Every year that freeze continues, inflation quietly drags more of our income into tax without a single rate changing. Now Burnham actually floated unfreezing it over the weekend, except by Monday he was already hedging, saying that it'd be difficult given the financial circumstances, and by Wednesday, today, people close to him were briefing that it's not part of the plan at all. 4 days, floated, hedged, dropped, because the Resolution Foundation put the cost of doing it at £3.7 billion by 2029, and that's money that this government just doesn't have. But this is still a ticking political time bomb, because the new full state pension is £241.30 a week, which across the year is £12,548. So it's now just £22 beneath the personal allowance. So if that freeze holds much longer, the state pension becomes taxable income for people whose only income is the state pension. And let's just sit with that for a second, okay? So the government pays you the money, then the government writes to you asking for a bit of it back. 2 letters from the same government and probably from the same printer. Also, nobody's filling in a tax return over this. HMRC works it out and posts you a bill, which means someone at HMRC has to write to a 70-year-old to claim back a couple of quid that the DWP sent them. And the optics of this for Labour will be awful, and for years to come. The headlines will read that Labour taxes the state pension, and no Chancellor will survive that. So he's going to have to deal with it eventually, which brings us to side door number 2. Money that isn't wages. And this is where I think most of us actually get hit. And interestingly, it's been the least covered part so far. And this one definitely isn't speculation, because it's already happening. From April this year, dividend tax went up 2 points. Basic rate is now 10.75%, higher rate is 35.75%. So on a 40 grand dividend, that's £800 a year more for doing absolutely nothing different. And from April 2027, savings interest gets exactly the same treatment. Basic, higher, and additional rate all going up 2 points. So if you've got money sitting in an ordinary savings account, the tax on your interest is going up regardless of whatever Healey decides to do next. Do you see the pattern? 2 taxes, the same 2-point rise on the rates that hit most people, both already set and neither of them touched payslips, which leaves a very obvious gap, because there's one big tax on money that isn't wages, capital gains, and Healey has voted to increase it 7 times. Now, we cannot say this as certainty, but a Chancellor who needs money, that can't touch wages, that's voted to raise capital gains 7 times. I think we can see where this is going. Side door number 3, property. This is the one I think is most likely and least talked about. Healey has consistently voted for an annual tax on high-value homes, what the papers call a mansion tax. And actually, we've already got one. Reeves announced it at the last budget. From 2028, homes over 2 million quid will pay an extra £2,500 to £7,500 a year on top of council tax. But to work out who pays, the Valuation Office is out revaluing every home in the top 3 council tax bands. Now, Burnham is reportedly keen on replacing both council tax and stamp duty with an annual property levy of around 0.48% of a home's value. So I ran it on my own house, £475,000, which at 0.48% is £2,280 a year or £190 a month. Now, I currently pay £273 a month in council tax. Besides the bins, I don't really know what that's for, but this would save me, all right, so if council tax was stripped and I had this property levy, this would save me nearly £1,000 a year. And Fairer Share, who campaigned for this, claimed that 75% of households would pay less. And that's because English council tax bands are still based on what your house was worth in 1991. It's ridiculous. Okay, so cheaper homes are overtaxed and expensive ones get off lightly. So pricing it as a percentage of actual value doesn't just raise more money, it moves who pays, and it moves it onto people who are asset rich and cash poor. Bought in London in 1985, never moved, now sitting on a £1.5 million property, well, that's £7,200 a year that you'll need to cough up, which is exactly why the skeptics have a point. And look at what Reeves actually did. She had the option of the full proportional system, and instead she went for a surcharge on 1% of homes instead, because revaluing all 25 million is years of work and creates millions of losers, all of whom vote. But if there's one chancellor in living memory with the background to try, ex-Treasury, ex-local government, ex-housing, it's this one. I'd watch this space closely. Side door number 4, defense bonds. And this one's genuinely interesting for savings. The idea is that the government sells bonds directly to the public, ring-fence for defense spending. The Lib Dems reckon it could raise up to £20 billion, and one version floated in Whitehall would have come with inheritance tax relief. Healey even agreed to back a version of it before he resigned, but Reeves's Treasury ruled it out. Well, guess who's in charge of the Treasury now? If that comes back, you'd probably see an NS&I style product with a Union Jack and a drone on. And Hargreaves Lansdown made exactly the right point about these. Patriotism is not a substitute for a competitive rate. If a defense bond pays less than the best easy access account, then it isn't a sound investment. And if we look at depositscout.com right now, we can see that the top easy access accounts are as high as 5%. So if these bonds don't land higher than that, they will be hard to argue in favor of. But if they land with inheritance tax relief, a lower headline rate could still beat a market-leading savings account, depending on the size of your estate. I think that's the only version of this that's genuinely compelling, although currently fewer than 5% of UK deaths result in an inheritance tax charge, so very few people will benefit from such relief. Whoop-de-doo. And quickly, the two things that aren't changing, and this may or may not be good news depending on how wrinkly you are, Burnham has said that the triple lock stays, no mid-parliament change, and the ISA reform is already locked in. From April 2027, the cash ISA allowance drops to £12,000 unless you're 65 or over, in which case you keep the full 20 grand, and the stocks and shares ISA allowance stays at 20k either way. It's just the cash bit that shrinks. The logic being that if you're older, you've got less time to ride out the stock market, so you shouldn't be pushed into investing, which is fair enough, actually. I don't hate that reasoning, it makes sense. But look at where it leaves you if you're, say, 37, like me. My cash shelter shrinks by £8,000. The tax on any interest outside of that goes up in the same month. And I'm funding a triple lock that I'd bet money on doesn't exist, at least in this form, by the time I get there. To be fair, plenty of pensioners get hit by that savings tax rise too, and a state pension of £240 a week is hardly living it up. But the direction is hard to miss. Okay, if you are old, you keep the wrapper. If you're young, you keep the bill. But don't worry, Burnham and Healey have saved us £25, and from January they'll knock £1 off your bus fare. What else can we look forward to then? Well, in the medium term, I think he's the most likely chancellor in a decade to go after property and investment income, and one of the least likely to touch the headline rates on your payslip, not because he doesn't want the money. He's desperate for it, but because Labour promised they won't. This is a man who resigned over a funding gap and now has to close a much bigger one, with the 3 biggest levers bolted shut. Something has to give, and I don't think it's going to be their manifesto.